Welcome to Justice for All Now. This is your host, Hannah Zuberi. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused TV channel. You can watch us on Muslim Network TV 24/7, on Galaxy 19 satellite, Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire. Today, we're going to be discussing the Uyghur crisis, the intersection of the war on terror, settler colonialism, and genocide with our guest, Sean Roberts and Mubashira. And I'm going to, Mubashira, please, you have to excuse me if I pronounce your last name wrong and correct me if I'm wrong. Mubashira Tazamma.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, great. To introduce both of you, thank you so much for being here. Sean Roberts is the Director of International Development Studies at the Elliott School. He is a cultural, at George Washington University, he's a cultural anthropologist with extensive applied experience in international development work. He's conducted ethnographic fieldwork among the Uyghur people of Central Asia and China during the 1990s. He has published extensively on this community in scholarly journals and collected volumes. Today, we're particularly going to be discussing Sean's new book, The War on Uyghurs, Campaign Against Xinjiang's Muslims. Mubashira is a researcher at the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University. She's also a journalist. She's an academic researcher and focuses on global Islamophobia. Her current work centers on China's campaign on genocide against Uyghur Muslims, and her analysis has been published in The Independent, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Religious Response, and The New Arab. Thank you, both of you, for being here and being part of this extremely crucial discussion. We talk a lot about this as part of our Save Uyghur campaign and have been working on this cause for a long time, and is extremely important for us to have research and people of your caliber contributing to this to highlight the atrocities that are being committed against the Uyghur people. Please, I wanted to first just to get to know you a little bit better, and both of you. So if you could share a little bit more about yourselves and how you got involved in this work. Sean, if you'd like to go with this.
Sure. So, I originally was interested when I was a long time ago when I was in college in communist countries. This was in the 80s during the Reagan period. I was somewhat skeptical of how awfully they portrayed the Soviet Union as the evil empire at that time. So I wanted to learn more about it. And I wasn't able to study in the Soviet Union initially, but I was able to study in Yugoslavia. And in Yugoslavia, I became very interested in Islam because there was a significant issue. There was a significant population of Muslims in Yugoslavia. And this was in 1987, and I became also interested in nationalism, which was another thing that was a very big issue in Yugoslavia, obviously. And even though that was before the Civil War, you could kind of see that there was a lot of tensions that could erupt into violence going forward. And so when I returned to college, I decided I was going to study the Muslims of the Soviet Union. And I went to Soviet Uzbekistan and studied for a year. And I was surprised to find that a lot of the American scholarship on the Muslims of Central Asia had suggested that there were very serious tensions between Russians and the Muslim populations of Central Asia. And I didn't really find that to be the case. There were some tensions, but it was certainly not kind of a political force that was going to create havoc in the Soviet Union. But I had a winter break, and I met a Uyghur scholar who was studying in Uzbekistan, and he suggested I go to the Uyghur region of China, which I did, and found a very different situation there. Even though Uyghurs are very closely related culturally, linguistically, historically with the Uzbek people, the languages are almost mutually intelligible. But the situation was completely different, and there was much more tension between Uyghurs and the Chinese state than was the case among Muslims in Central Asia. And so I decided from then on that I was going to study Uyghurs, and in particular, my dissertation research was on Uyghurs between the Soviet Union and China, because there's a large diaspora in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and they were reuniting with family members in China during the 1990s when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork. And I've been studying Uyghur issues ever since.
So I got started with studying Islamophobia really because of my own personal experiences. I grew up in the United States. I came of age with the war on terror. I was in elementary school when 9/11 happened, and then George W. Bush inaugurated the war on terror. And so, I saw the bombings happen in Afghanistan, and then I saw the invasion of Iraq. And then I most remember Guantanamo. I remember detainees. I remember the orange jumpsuits. And that really sparked an interest into how this was able to happen. And not only how this was able to happen within the US, but like how did the international community allow this to happen? Um, and so then I got into advocacy, but Islamophobia was always something I was very interested in. And I actually started my work at Bridge right as Donald Trump was elected. And you saw really Islamophobia go mainstream, and you saw Islamophobia in its campaign. You saw the targeting of Muslims, and then most notably, you saw the Muslim ban. And then I personally did not know about the Uyghurs before I started seeing around 2018. I started seeing articles. There were just very few about the camps, and I was shocked. So I just started doing my own research and looking into it, and looking into the works of academics, and listening to Uyghur activists abroad who were talking about this. And I was appalled at the level that it had become. I don't think in any other place we've seen the war on terror being used in this manner, where there are networks of concentration camps. So I just started researching more and more, and the more you look into it, the more you see how extreme and how heightened this campaign of repression is. And so that's where my work has been. And I'm also very interested in the technological aspect of it, of how China has really used surveillance technology to heighten this repression and create what is essentially a police state in the Uyghur homeland.
We believe that this is a physical genocide, according to the very definitions of the UN definition of a genocide. So I know you touch on this a little bit in your book, Sean, but I'd like you to explain what is your take on this. What have you seen in your work and your research?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with you. I mean, particularly looking at the UN Convention on Genocide, and I wrote something early on, actually, I think it was the summer of 2017, maybe, saying as much, that, if you look at the Convention on Genocide, this very much falls within that purview. And it's very much a campaign to destroy Uyghur identity. It involves depopulation, it involves sterilization, and there's been lots of people who've also died from torture and just extreme conditions in these mass internment camps. But it does differ from, I think the Holocaust, in the sense that there's not a conscious effort to exterminate everybody physically. And I think, one of the problems is that the concept of genocide has become so linked to the idea of the Holocaust that sometimes people don't really understand that genocide is a much broader issue.
Mhm.
When I look at the Uyghurs, what I see is much more an attempt to destroy them as a people, to displace them, and to ultimately marginalize them within Chinese society. I mean, it's essentially getting rid of them, but it doesn't necessarily have to include mass extermination. It's much more like what we've seen happen to indigenous peoples around the world, Native Americans, Native peoples in Australia and New Zealand. So, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's very much kind of an outcome of settler colonization, which I think is what China's real goal in the region is. And, they've used terrorism as a justification for that. But it's not about security. It's really about excluding the Uyghur people from their homeland and marginalizing them within China and depopulating them.
I want to really talk about settler colonialism. You write about it in your book. You have visited this region, as you were talking about, in the 1990s. Your first trip was in, I believe, the year 1990. What have you observed in your visits then? What was your experience like? I want to really see how things have changed from 1990 to 2017,
Mhm.
and how has the identity been destroyed as an observer, as an anthropologist who's studied this region?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. It When I went there in 1990, one of the things that got me so interested in the region and the people was that their traditional culture was very well preserved, and particularly in contrast to across the border in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, created a multi-ethnic idea of the nation, but in doing so, they certainly acculturated everybody towards kind of a Russian cultural norm in many ways. And when I went to the Uyghur region of China in 1990, I found a place that was very different. I mean, you would, once you left the capital city of the region, Urumqi, and you can also find kind of Han Chinese dominated villages in the north. But once you leave those areas and you go into the south, which have been majority Uyghur demographically and had also been very Uyghur in character, you wouldn't even think you were in China, in the People's Republic of China. You'd see some, red banners in Chinese language, but at that time, I was starting to speak Uyghur. I didn't know any Chinese language, and I was able to easily travel throughout the whole region speaking Uyghur. It was also at a time in the 1980s was a very positive time for Uyghurs in China because after the Cultural Revolution, the state allowed Uyghurs to open up mosques, to re-explore their culture, to start publishing. And so there's a real cultural renaissance happening even into the 1990s, where you had mosques all over the place, new mosques built. You had people studying religion. You had people studying their history. You had intellectuals producing historical novels that were exploring Uyghur history. You had musicians creating fantastic music. So it was a very vibrant time. Throughout the 90s, I could see the window of cultural freedom and certainly political freedom increasingly narrowed. And you had at that time the Chinese government was calling any kind of Uyghur dissent or disloyalty separatism. So you'd have these anti-separatism campaigns that would end up focusing in some cultural elements. But even throughout the 1990s, the Uyghur culture was vibrant and very much a part of that region. You couldn't really separate the territory from the Uyghur culture.
And so another part of when you look at settler colonialism is the extraction of resources. Obviously, this crisis, this genocide, we believe, is very much tied into the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'd like to ask both of you, how do you see this extraction of resources? Where does this stand for, especially in the form of forced labor? And even I'd really wanted to get your takes on organ harvesting, because this is something that we are seeing, I don't think, unprecedented levels of extraction of human resources, where you are actually using the human body, the Uyghur body, every part of it, from the skin to internal organs, as a part of this project, this settler colonial project. Mubashira, if you'd like to go first, and then perhaps John can.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I believe about 80% of the cotton that comes from China comes from the Uyghur homeland. It's gas-rich and natural resources, but it also plays a key kind of stop along the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a billion-dollar project that China is instituting to connect itself to mainland Europe. To go, there's going to be path down Pakistan to go to the port. So that area where the Uyghur homeland is very key in this Belt and Road Initiative. And I think what Dr. Roberts has mentioned before, where China sort of was criminalizing this idea of separatism within the settler colonial context, is the right to have an independent homeland. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think they also part of it want to do this is because they need that region secure for their own economic benefit. So the goal is to strike down this sort of independence movement, this right to have their own homeland, because the region is central in this Belt and Road Initiative project.
I think there's some very important points made right now about how this may differ from classic settler colonialism, in the sense that I think it's not just about resources. In fact, colonialism has always been about resources, but settler colonialism is different. There's one scholar that I use in my book who compares the difference between a virus, which must also exploit the population, the people of a territory, and a bacteria, where really all that is needed is the territory itself. So I think that's what's happening in a settler colonialism situation. And one of the interesting questions is why, if this region was essentially conquered by China in the mid-18th century, and in the 19th century it was essentially integrated as a part of China, why does it take until 2000, the years after 2000, after the beginning of the War on Terror, to really make this more about settler colonialism? And I think that's because for a long time it was seen as a buffer zone, not very important. It was seen as a place where they could extract resources, but it didn't require that Han settlers had to come in and actually occupy this area. But in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, what's less important than the extraction of resources is the location of the Uyghur homeland, which provides access to resources outside China. So through the Belt and Road Initiative, the Uyghur homeland is essentially a hub that is providing China the ability to engage economically with places to the west and southwest. So it fits into, for example, what China's doing in Pakistan through CPEC. For that to happen, for them to for the Chinese state to really access the port of Gwadar, it all has to go through the Uyghur homeland. And I think that's what created some of the urgency that has really made the situation spiral into a kind of genocidal strategy, as opposed to some sort of, kind of a containment and political repression, which was more what was happening in the 1990s.
And the language that is being used is the language of the global war on terror. Mubashir, you write that this language had not been used by the Chinese prior to George Bush. What you write that while the Chinese violence against Uyghurs dated back decades, the language of terrorism entered the government lexicon shortly after the US President George W. Bush inaugurated the global war on terror. What threads have you noticed since then, and what can you guys highlight, both of you, important turns? Because when we're looking at this crisis as it is today, there have been specific turning points. I wanted to highlight those turning points.
Yeah, so with the war on terror discourse, the word terrorism entered, mainstream sort of discourse in the U.S., mainstream language on the news. It was after 9/11. We saw terrorism, terrorists, extremism, radicalism, all of that really, really come to the forefront when it came to specifically talking about Muslims and Islam. And that sort of language serves to also dehumanize individuals. So what it does is, when they talk about radical Islam or when they talk about Islamic terrorism, it's saying that there's something unique within Islam and thus followers of Islam, so Muslims, that they're prone to violence. So once that is set in stone, that makes it so you can institute policies. Doesn't matter what kind of policies, because your aim is to supposedly stop this terrorism and this violence. So in the U.S., that was inaugurated under George Bush. China actually got the U.S. to render the East Turkestan independence movement, I believe. There's a small political group, and they got them to render them as a terrorist group. There were actually, I believe, 5 Uyghurs who were imprisoned in Guantanamo under this. So that's where you see the beginning of this sort of language China is infusing into their campaign against the Uyghurs. China inaugurated its own People's War on Terror in 2014, and it's fighting the three evils of separatism, extremism, and terrorism. And we've seen the language of separatism before within the settler colonial context, but now we have extremism and terrorism. And then with that sort of in place, China was able to say, when they defended, at first they denied the camps existed around 2017. That's when it really upticked. And they denied the existence. And then they said, oh, these are, vocational schools. And then they said these are re-education centers to rehabilitate the Uyghur people because they've been infected by an ideological illness. And that ideological illness, they said, was Islam. Because, the markers of this illness supposedly was, if you grew a long beard, if you wore a veil, if you observed Ramadan, if you fasted. And these are all markers of Muslim religiosity, Islamic religious expression. So that the language that was used was able to say, the Chinese government was able to say, well, we need these measures because the Uyghur people are prone to terrorism. So you can see kind of the line where with the inauguration of the global war on terror, this language was kind of provided as a narrative for any sort of government to use to target their own marginalized Muslim community.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this right now in India.
Yeah.
And this is very concerning because this sort of language and these there are detention camps in Assam, in Punjab, in 5 other states in India right now. So the war on terror language was exported from the United States to China. And now China's methodology is now being exported to India. Um, and with two genocide alerts out for India right now, as well as, we just had a discussion of this being a not only just a cultural genocide against the Uyghur people, but a physical genocide. This is extremely, being Muslim in today's world, in these regions where Muslims are minority, we are this trend is, it's not just a trend, it's not just rising. These are millions of people's lives on the line. So Sean, what's
Yeah, I mean, I think one point I want to make is, and this is something I try to do in my book, because one of the things I didn't start out as somebody who was interested in terrorism. I was interested in the Uyghurs, and I wanted to understand, how they became characterized as terrorists. So one of the first things I did was look for a definition of terrorism. And what's amazing is that the the research committee that does research on terrorism has no consensus as to what constitutes terrorism.
mm,
And this also goes for states. In fact, it's very clear that states don't want there to be an international consensus defining terrorism, because it's a very convenient label to use against any kind of opponents that they might have.
mhm,
And this has a long history that's not only tied to Islam. I mean, in the 19th century, they talked about anarchists as terrorists. And during the 1960s, they talked about all kinds of different anti-war groups as terrorist groups um, throughout the world, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. And one of the, I think 9/11 basically married this concept with Islam, which was extremely detrimental to Muslims. And I think the larger problem, though, is that really, when we talk about terrorism, we should talk about action. We should not talk about ideology. I find it actually problematic, the kind of insertion of extremism into the discourse of terrorism, because these are two different things, and extremism is a highly subjective concept. I think when we talk about terrorism, we should be talking specifically about political violence carried out deliberately targeting civilians. And it doesn't matter if you're a Salafi jihadist, or an anarchist, or a right wing militia. If you are targeting civilians, I think that is something that should be condemned. But we've lost track of that part of it. It's become associated with specific tendencies in Islam, and particularly Salafism, um, and I find it that it's kind of gotten loose from its moorings, which means that states are able to wield it as a weapon. They're able to weaponize it, and both in Muslim states where it's used against any kind of domestic political opponents that they want to characterize as evil, or in majority non-Muslim countries where that it's used to target Muslim minorities, which is the case in China and India. So I think it's a very dangerous kind of path that we've gone in the war on terror, where we've lost any sense of what we're really fighting against.
and when we look at that, so if we can talk a little bit about the protests that did happen in Urumqi and Gulja. These were uprisings. These were people, from our perspective, is a people who were upset at non-distribution of, equality in access to jobs, access to be able to practice their faith. How are incidents like those taken, and how do you get from that to concentration camps. And what's next?
Let me address the incidents you're talking about in Ulja, and that was in 1998,
Mm-hmm.
and in Urumqi in 2009. Those are, what's even more concerning is they weren't really initially uprisings.
Mm-hmm.
They were protests, peaceful protests. First in Ulja was about the right to practice religion. In Urumqi in 2009, it wasn't really connected to religion at all. It was about the fact that uh, a group of Uyghur men who had been working in a factory in southern China had been killed because they were accused of raping Han women. Um, and the people were asking for justice for that. But one of the things that starting in the 1990s, it was impossible to have a peaceful protest in the Uyghur region of China. And this is really important because I think part of the kind of colonial dimension of this area in its relationship to modern China means that this area has always been seen as an exception. Throughout the 90s, social scientists were commenting on all kinds of peaceful protests throughout China.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Uyghur region, if you started any kind of peaceful protest, it was considered separatism and it was violently suppressed. And in both of those cases, when it was violently suppressed, the protesters pushed back and it became a violent melee.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the 2009 incident is particularly important because after that, it turned into ethnic riots, which
Mm-hmm.
I think are more about the tension experienced in the region over its mass development at the time. You had a lot of Han immigrants who themselves were under a lot of stress to find work and to adapt to a new area, and you had lots of Uyghurs who were seeing all of these Hans encroaching on their homeland, and it turned into violence against each other. And it includes both Uyghurs and Han vigilantes going after Uyghurs. But after the case, it was 3 days of violence throughout the city. And after that, the government exclusively blamed Uyghurs. And they specifically, with, as far as I understand, no logic, decided it was Uyghur migrants from the South who were religious. And that really began a very significant campaign in the southern region of the Uyghur homeland, where anybody who was religious was under constant surveillance. Almost one person described to me as being under house arrest. And they had police and security groups that would come in and randomly search people's houses. And sometimes when this happened, things would again turn violent. So most of the violence from that period, 2009 until 2014, was essentially these clashes between rural Uyghurs, um, largely religious Uyghurs, who were under pressure from security forces. So, it is kind of reminiscent of what we've seen in America in terms of racially profiled police harassment and abuse. And this, created kind of a cycle of violence, repression. And after each incident of violence, the state repression got worse. There'd be more violence, more repression. And that eventually erupted into a couple acts of violence undertaken by Uyghurs that look, in my definition of terrorism, like a terrorist attack. They deliberately targeted civilians. But that began uh, as my colleague said, that began the People's War on Terror,
Mm-hmm.
the Chinese state side. And during that time, in 2014, my research shows that's where the government was already essentially laying down the frameworks for what was going to happen after 2017 with the mass internment camps, re-education, mass surveillance. So I think it's important to understand that there weren't actually many instances of actual rebellion. It was response to state violence.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to point out when you said that it was largely religious, the religious population that spoke up. And in my talks with the Uyghurs that I know here, Uyghur Americans, many of them say, several of them had very close ties to the CCP in the sense that they were all card-carrying CCP members. They never imagined if even early 2017, if people had told them that their relatives would be picked up, that deans of universities who were intimate with the Chinese government would be taken away. So what happened, if in your analysis, what happened to make that, that switch between now we're just targeting this certain aspect of certain sort of population to now we're targeting everybody?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll start, and then maybe Mubashara has things to add to that. I mean, I think there was, part of it was the fact that it was framed by the state as counterterrorism, which was part of the reason that it began focusing on people who were openly religious, right? Because the state, and I think the Chinese state itself has a very poor understanding of Islam. It's not very tolerant of religion at all. So, it was kind of a logical step for the state to look at um, the religious population as being the potential terrorists. But at the same time, I think after 2009, after the riots in Urumqi, the state began to identify the Uyghur people as the problem. A lot of the people in Urumqi were very secular. The initial protesters in Urumqi in the summer of 2009 were carrying Chinese flags, and they had slogans in the Chinese language asking for justice as citizens of China, not as Muslims. And they weren't even asking about religious freedom. I think after that, you had this kind of slippery slope. And I think this, Mubashir probably has some more to say about this in terms of how Islamophobia has a tendency to do this. But, it's by identifying this idea that you have this ideological problem within the population that you've identified as Islamic extremism, and all of a sudden everybody is potentially guilty of it and suspected of being part of the problem. And that I think, that can very quickly translate into just a racially profiled pogrom, where it's all Uyghurs. They're all potentially extremists. They're all part of the problem. And I think that also, go back to the earlier discussion of the Belt and Road Initiative, that aligned very well with other issues that the state was dealing with, where they wanted to essentially take over this region, develop it in a way where the Uyghurs were incidental, and if they were going to be a problem, they should just get rid of it.
Mubashir, please do comment on how this is an aspect, an aspect of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim bigotry globally.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Roberts was saying was right on the ball with that, because what happens with Islamophobia is, when the state says there's terrorism, extremism coming from this segment of a wider population, it renders the entire population safe. I think we've seen very good examples of in the U.S. and Europe, where, after 9/11 in the US, under the guise of targeting, radical Islam or extremism, entire Muslim communities in New York were under surveillance. Mosques were under surveillance. And you can see, so this sort of logic is what the Chinese government is using in the Uyghur homeland, in the sense that no matter if you're a practicing Muslim or not, just because you are Uyghur Muslim by your culture, by your identity, deems you a threat to the state. So whether or not you're a CCP card holding member, it doesn't matter, because your very being is a threat to the state. And say you're not religious, maybe the state says, okay, they might become religious. That's the thing here. It doesn't matter if it's a small subset. The entire population is collectively responsible and is rendered suspect. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that we see this pushback, and the pushback is, this is U.S. propaganda. This is the second Cold War. And because the U.S. is the only one right now who's talking about this on a government level, their policies being implemented, bills being pushed out. The Uyghur Human Rights Bill, Act was passed. Now the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And a lot of people don't understand that a lot of work goes into putting these acts together. There's a tremendous amount of advocacy being done by Uyghur activists, Uyghur Americans, other human rights activists to get these bills on the floor. And so how do you counter this pushback?
I'd like to take that, because that actually really infuriates me, just because of the amount of evidence that's available, and also the amount of advocacy and activism being done by the Uyghur Muslim community abroad. And to have these sort of smears against the community to say that a genocide isn't happening is just truly abhorrent, in my opinion. The thing is, a lot of these smears are coming from, anti-imperialists about, oh, this is U.S. imperialism again. The thing is, imperialism isn't, only a U.S. thing. Imperialism can be taken by any sort of country. So that to me doesn't make any sense. There is widespread evidence. You have, images, Google satellite images of the camps. You have testimonies. You have Dr. Adrian Zenz has done fantastic work uncovering government documents itself. So Chinese government documents that I believe it was the Kirkash list, and it was a list of hundreds of Uyghurs, and they had put down why they were taken to camps, and a lot of it was, they didn't follow the one child, two child policy. They practicing your faith or whatnot. So yeah, the claims that it's not a genocide is really, really, I think, detrimental and really just out of place.
And if I can add to that, I think one of my main concerns is this is a humanitarian issue, and it should be something that appeals to us as human beings. And it has become geopoliticized. I blame some of that on kind of the Trump administration's stances towards China. So it's become very easy to claim that this is really just part of the Trump administration attacking China. And it also, it is very easy, it becomes very easy to say, well, the United States has not treated Muslims well, which is completely accurate. And one of the things I try to point out in my book is that, the U.S.-led war on terror was part of what facilitated what's happened to Uyghurs. I think, there needs to be some research, and I'm hoping some of the people who, there's an increasing body of research in the academy about misinformation and the way that social media is being used to spread misinformation. And I would really welcome a study of these groups that have been actively denying the Uyghur issue on the web to see, what kind of connections they may have to other state actors or so on. But beyond that, the other thing is on the American left, the far left, we've seen this strange sympathy, I think, for the Assad regime. And as a result, this portion of the left that supports the Assad regime tends to actually also internalize the war on terror discourse. They're saying, well, those people are terrorists. And it becomes very odd to see these people who are claiming to be anti-imperialist essentially adopting this discourse that has been used for violent imperialist objectives. And I think it's really unfortunate because I agree with Mubashara. It's unfortunate, for people like myself or her who get criticized by these people. It's unfortunate, but what really hurts is when they deny this to people who know this is happening and it's affecting them on a personal level.
Exactly.
And that's really horrible.
Exactly. We have people on our staff with 90 relatives that no one knows where they are. They have not been able to get in touch with them. They don't. And part of this genocide denialism is this obsessiveness on these re-education camps. There are so many aspects to this genocide that are just totally being not studied, not talked about. The family separation, the forced marriages, and not even in Islam, it would not be even called a marriage. It's just state sanctioned rape to have some man come and live in your home. And and to be married outside the faith forcefully, that's not considered a marriage in Islam. It's considered trafficking. It's considered, there's just the organ harvesting, so I feel like a lot of time, and even with this, when we talk about the concentration camps, the prisons aren't being addressed. So many of these people have been transferred from the camps into prisons and given even harsher sentences. Forced labor camps get looked over. So this is particularly, and I do urge people who are working on this and doing the research help, because a lot of this genocide denial is highlight the fact that this is another stage of genocide denialism, and then genocide triumphism. That and you'll find this as well, that there are parts of the Chinese society that are applauding what the government is doing. And so why are we not looking at that as another stage in this genocide? But we're at the end of the hour, and I really thank both of you for being here. It's been a great discussion. I urge everybody to do follow Mubashara and Sean on Twitter, and read their articles, share their work. Sean's book is available on Amazon, and on the Princeton Press, The War on Uyghurs, China's internal campaign against Muslim minorities. And it is available hardcover on Kindle as well. He talks in a, he's talked to several Uyghurs and gotten and has really highlighted their voices, which is extremely important, as we know it is tremendously difficult for Uyghurs to talk about this because it consistently affects their families who are still in East Turkestan. So thank you so much to both of you for being here and being a part of the program.